welcome to the Theology Pugcast. The gang is together again, and I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I'm actually on the road right now. I'm in Moscow, Idaho, because I'm going to be delivering a lecture at NSA, the New St. Andrews College, this afternoon, so that's why I'm here. So I'm sitting in a setting that is, if you're a regular viewer of the podcast on Spotify or YouTube, you don't recognize the environment. But this is an Airbnb. Anyway, let's kick it over to you, Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and a few other things at Gordon Conwell and a few other places.
Okay. I probably should insert here that I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine, particularly since we got a big conference coming up next week, and I'm going to be speaking at that. And so if you're in the Chicago area, you really ought to look into that. It's going to be a great lineup, and it's going to be a very interesting time. Anyway, enough of that. Glenn, it's your day. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what we're talking about?
Okay, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm currently a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I work for Reflections Ministries, and relevant for the topic today, I am a retired history professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, specializing in European history, particularly in the Renaissance and Reformation period. I should note one correction to Chris. As we're recording now, the Touchstone Conference is next week. By the time you hear this, it will be a few weeks ago.
Thanks, Glenn. That's true.
And actually, before I begin my topic, I am going to put in an unsolicited advertisement. I am actually starting my own Patreon on my website, everysquareinch.org, esquareinch.org. I am going to be doing a couple of different things with that. I am currently teaching a course on Revelation that will be available in 15 to 20-minute bursts weekly. I'm also doing longer classes. The first one on one of my favorite topics, one of the ones that are most popular at the university, on the Black Death. But then I've got a rather lengthy sequence dealing ultimately with the theme of disenchantment and enchantment, looking at this historically and ultimately leading to where we are today with that. That's going to be, like I said, a very long sequence. It'll probably take me nearly a year to get through all of that. So anyway, like I said, an unsolicited advertisement there. If you're interested, the website where you can find the information is esquareinch.org. Anyway,
let's go for it, Glenn.
Yeah, our topic today is on what I would describe as ideological revisionist history. Revisionist history is not a new thing, and there's a lot of positive things that can happen with revisionist history. When we talk about revisionism, what we mean is, most historical periods have sort of an accepted narrative, an accepted way in which that history is viewed, a particular lens that the history is understood through. And this is just something that develops where a consensus builds among historians. But then somebody comes along and says, you know what, this is the wrong lens to look at this stuff through. And often the revisionists end up coming up with some really important insights and better ways of looking at the material than sort of the standard view would be. The one I really like to point to as a really good case of positive revisionism would be the French Revolution. Sort of the standard view of the French Revolution for years was essentially viewing it through a Marxist lens. This is essentially an uprising functionally of the proletariat, something along those lines, or it was an anticipation of the proletariat revolution, or it fits in with this sort of Marxist schema of history, economics, all of these kinds of things. But then you begin getting a number of historians who say, well, wait a minute, not so fast. The French Revolution is really not just about economics. There's a lot of other things that are going on there. Economics is certainly a part of it. But there's an entire social dimension of this that economics doesn't even begin to touch. Maybe what we need is a social interpretation rather than an economic interpretation of the French Revolution. And so you get historians like Cobbett and others who are coming in with these alternative interpretations of the French Revolution. And these are the people with the term revisionism or revisionist historians. This is really where that term gained popularity, these revisionist interpretations of the French Revolution. And frankly, I think they were really onto something, and they really contributed a great deal to our understanding of the revolution and gave us a better window into it by my lights than the sort of standard interpretation that had been there. So the point here is that revisionism isn't always bad. The problem with the standard interpretation of the French Revolution, I would argue, is it was effectively ideologically driven. It was built around this sort of Marxist vision of history. This is the way things work in history. It's a little more complicated than that, but basically that's what was going on. What we're seeing right now is revisionist history of the United States and of Europe and of the Western world. The revisionists are the ones that are ideologically driven. So we see this in the 1619 project, woke history, that kind of thing. But increasingly, we're seeing it also on the right, where we're getting revisionist history that is ideologically driven from the right as well. The most recent thing that has come up on this score was the kerfuffle over Churchill. That came up with Tucker on with Cooper, where he argued that the real villain of World War II was Hitler, was not Hitler, was Churchill, whom he described as a psychopath, and like I said, the real villain. He argued effectively that what Hitler was really after was peace with Britain. He didn't really want to fight Britain. He didn't really want to fight France. He he wasn't all that interested. He didn't see Russia as really his main threat. He saw America as his main threat. He comes up with all of these different kinds of things. But that Churchill was really the bad guy here. And in a sense, he's trying to rehabilitate Hitler, or sort of. He does say Hitler was evil. He was a bad guy. He says that up front. But he spends actually more of his time when he talks about Hitler saying, yeah, he was a bad guy, but he wasn't that bad a guy. I mean, there are, he wasn't as bad as we make him out to be, is sort of the sense you get from him. But Churchill was really the villain of the piece. Now, the interesting thing from my perspective here is that's not a whole lot different from what happens on the left. When you look at the ideologically driven woke historians, Churchill is a villain as well. But he's a villain for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be good to kind of go into those different reasons. So we just heard about why, the Martyr Make Substack guy thinks he was bad or worse than he's been made out to be, and Hitler wasn't as bad as he's been made out to be. What's the story on the left? What's the ideological rubric?
That's mostly having to do with colonial issues. His work in Africa, and especially most lately, I've seen things about India. There's a famine in Bengal during World War II, and they say that Churchill stopped shipping food to Bengal, and that creates this famine that kills all these people in India. And in fact, there was a famine in Bengal, and food wasn't getting through to it. But they ignore the fact that the Japanese had attacked the area, and they couldn't get food through because of the Japanese Navy. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that are going on there that are simply ignored. That they then simply blame on Churchill.
Well, but that's the interesting point, is because what you have going on here, and I am not a historian, so if I get the kind of ways of reading history off, you can correct me here. But what you have here is you have a series of events that happened, and we can know something about them. And then we have evaluative judgments that go into that set of facts and what you can infer sensibly from it and not. And the evaluative judgments start to now take on more extreme particular group interpretations rather than kind of a more common consensus that may have classically been about certain kinds of reading at history? Is this the way hermeneutics has now become sort of
Yeah, it strikes me
driven by the experience center of a group?
Yeah, and the ideology connects to that experience center and is intended to valorize it. But when we think about ideology, I think it's a kind of superimposition on the facts to sort them out. I've been thinking a lot about how ideologies resemble computer programs. I mean, old-fashioned computer programs, not AI, but just the way they function. They don't learn; they just categorize. So. Yeah. They just go in, they say, okay, what fits this category, what fits that category? We put those things in those places, and then we just, if things don't fit, we forget about them, or we just label them retrograde or something.
Well, actually, it's more like AI than you think it is.
Okay.
Because when you take a look at, I'll just use a current example. This has now been, quote, corrected, but someone asked Alexa for reasons to vote for Donald Trump, and it said, I can't give you political, I can't make statements about politics. You then asked for reasons to vote for Kamala Harris and got a very long answer.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that though, but
okay, AI. But think about that. That is an AI answer. Now they said, well, this is a glitch. No, it isn't a glitch. AI does what it's programmed to do. That was programmed in. Now, and that's the way ideology functions. It programs in certain kinds of answers that it will give, and it ignores, downplays, or denies anything that doesn't fit the ideological screen. It's very much like what happened in that particular incident with AI. So it even works with AI. It's computer programs generally, but even AI, the way AI is set up, it works exactly the same way. It gives you a grid, it gives you a screen that determines what kinds of answers it will or won't give. And ideology does exactly the same thing.
One of the things I'm after here, though, is that the part that everyone has access to, right, is the part that supposedly historians can somewhat agree on, right? I know that the facts are never that clear, but there's a series of things that happen, and there's a series of sources we have that can show what they happen. And for example, Oxford used to have kind of a classics department of history in church history, someone like a Henry Chadwick. Henry Chadwick was kind of looked at when I was going through, my doctoral work as someone committed to kind of the old detached historian paradigm. It was great for its day, but it wasn't ideological enough, or it was so stamped by its blind spots that it didn't capture all these things that feminist criticism and all these different, experiences left on the margins kind of stuff. And so those experiences left on the margin take on a certain kind of prominence because for some reason, this is ideological, they are seen as somehow morally superior to a consensus reading of a culture because somehow they were left out of the power picture. And so now, because they have been left out of the power picture, that becomes their credibility without having to earn that as an interpretive right. But actually, it's just because it's been left out of the picture. You have to listen to it, and you have to take it seriously. It's sort of what we do with symbolic figures now in culture, right? If they are symbolically representative of the marginalized group class, their ideology needs to become the kind of predominant one to chasten and limit the consensus experience of everyone who's had access to power. And this particular ideology, I think, is governing, like you say, both sides.
Yeah, I think that is exactly what happened. There was a history that focused on the elites, that focused on the what's going on politically, what's going on militarily, macroeconomics, all of those kinds of things. And then mid 20th century, you begin getting a movement toward asking other kinds of questions within social history that start dealing, as you said, with the more marginalized people. And I think there's value in that.
Yeah.
But it's important to realize as well that the marginalized people aren't the ones that are actually moving large events forward.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in seminary, we were talking about something in one of the church history classes. I don't even remember what it was. And the professor brought up, well, what were the peasants thinking at this point about something? And one of my fellow students, I won't mention his name because he may or may not be listening to the podcast. I don't know. I've lost track with him. He said to me afterwards, who cares what the peasants were thinking?
Right.
Because it didn't really shape the history in any significant way at all. And
Right.
what he was interested in is how it was shaping the history. What the social historians were interested in was, what was that guy's life like? It's a legitimate question, but it depends on what you're after in history. And in the case of the revisionist stuff we're seeing now, the ideological thing, what they are looking at, they are not just interested in what was the peasant thinking. What they're interested in is, why are things happening? And their fundamental argument is the history that we've been told, the history that the accepted history we've been told, the accepted story we've accepted about America, about Europe, and all of that, is a story that's told to the benefit of the elites. That the people in power are pushing this story because it's in their interests to push this story, even though it's not what really happened.
Yeah.
What really happened and why it really happened is something totally different. And they don't want that story told because it'll undermine their position.
So this brings up a problem, though, doesn't it? That the matter of what really happened is inaccessible according to this sort of thing, because every group is shading its reading of the events based on its own interests. So even though you might have a marginal group that has some things that they would like known, their own perspective on the matter is as kind of skewed as any other groups. I guess what I'm getting at is that we've lost our faith in the ability to kind of see reality.
That's true to a point, except for the fact that we're not consistent.
Mm-hmm.
If they were consistent, they would admit that if what we are saying is true, ours is just one perspective among many, and it has no more validity than anybody else's. But they are not, in fact, consistent. Their argument really is that our perspective is the true one, even though we say we don't believe that there is a true perspective.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it.
Well, and of course, it gets down to things that obviously will open up even the theological questions and questions they have in relationship to the Enlightenment, because I do think the Enlightenment had its own shaded, distorted view of things, even though we tend to think of it as sort of the kind of picture of objectivity. It really wasn't, and you don't need these marginal voices to say it. Our Christian faith has been arguing that since it was marginalized for its interpretations as the core group that it wanted to have marginalized, right? One of the things that does happen with Christianity is you do get a massive revision of all of world history, events, philosophy, and everything in light of the pivotal center of history, Christ, right? And so Christian history, the reading of Scripture and then the extension of it to everything else has a Christological center, but that doesn't mean it has to be shaded by the particulars of every aspect of the particulars of the Christian narrative, right? What it means is there is a real place for creation and history, and history does have a sort of intelligibility to it, even though it's not pure, right? We are bringing assumptions, but we can read certain things with the tools we've been given and endowments that have better credibility one way versus the other. But then that becomes a set of criteria that isn't completely ideological. It can actually have more, explanatory scope, or, there's a whole host of different things that go on there. So while we may not be able to have access to something called pure history and a pure interpretation, some are closer than others, and there are ways and tools of dealing with it that don't have to fall into the power play map. But yeah, once you're given over to it's all just power, and whose kind of narrative is going to have the interpretive center, well, you're stuck with this kind of relativism, which I think, Hegel helped to produce, amongst others, in the field of history. Hegel's influence in biblical studies in terms of history and interpretation is incredible. Even in the history of doctrine now, Hegel, everything's development, right? There is no kind of...
Well, when we think about, though, your comment there, Tom, about things being interpreted in light of the advent of Christ, what is being said is that there's something breaking into history. Yeah. That's the revelation of the meaning of things. So it's now we can have our shortcomings as we interpret that, but this is the point of reference. That was the Christian argument. The Christian argument wasn't we got a bunch of oppressed Jews over here in Palestine or Israel or Galilee or whatever, and we want you to pay attention to us. That wasn't the argument. Yeah. This is revelation from God about the future and about our need and what's been done to save us and those things.
Yeah. Now, actually, I'm going to move off of the kind of revisionist history that I was just talking about to a different kind of revisionism, and that has to do with biblical exegesis. And once again, I see left and right, oddly enough, doing some similar things here. A few years ago, I remember, might be more than a few now, I remember a big trend among some of the left-leaning evangelicals that functionally was denying the borderline denying the resurrection and maybe even denying it, and saying what Christianity was really about was the kingdom of God in this world. It isn't. It isn't. It isn't about. It isn't about the hope for the resurrection or the next life or heaven or anything like that. It's about the kingdom of God now and implementing it now and all those kinds of things, working to immanentize the eschaton, to use the technical terminology here. And these were people who were self-described evangelicals, albeit progressive evangelicals. Yeah. Recently, I've been running into a lot of rather rabid full preterists who are functionally arguing that Jesus is not coming back, that all of the prophecies of the return of Christ were accomplished when Jesus judged Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, thereby denying the return of the future return of Christ, denying the creeds and everything else. What are they doing? Both of them are functionally saying the accepted doctrine of eschatology is wrong, and whether from the left or the right, we are going to look at it in this other way. We've got the interpretive key that makes sense of this, and all you guys have bought into something that has really distorted what the gospel is, presumably for the sake of the people who have power within the church.
This reminds me of Paul's, incredulity in 1 Corinthians 15, where he's talking about, the resurrection has already happened, or basically the argument is if you think that this is we're not looking forward to a final resurrection, or then what are we doing here? It's kind of the sense that you get when you read that. That, by the way, is one of the, I think, chapters in the New Testament that needs to be looked at and worked on more frequently when it comes to preaching, just because of the centrality of the resurrection in Paul's statements concerning salvation.
Well, that's right. That's where your teleology is, in the full sense, when we talk about purposes, is tasted in the fullest and first fruit way by the church, but not in its completion, right? So part of the whole orientation of ourselves towards that which is our perfection, right, as the people of God in the new creation, is present, but not present. It's present in a depth way, not in its fullness, which comes with in the fullness of time, right? And that stuff is very key, because without eschatology and the resurrection, bodily resurrection of Christ from the dead, everything else is quite meaningless and vain, even our teleology, because teleology at that point can hide itself, right? Purposes can hide themselves, and then it becomes like Glenn said, different kinds of fundamental purposes using the same terminology, but all about sort of who has power now and who gets to exercise it. And the church has done damage itself throughout history when it has thought in those terms, especially when it did have access to more power.
Yeah, there was a book a while back. Don't remember the author. It was called something like The Paranoid Style in American Politics. What we're dealing with right now is the conspiratorial style in American politics or American ideology or whatever. That what you are seeing, or what I'm seeing increasingly, is a sense among people that there is a de facto conspiracy to hide the truth. And a conspiracy to hide the truth in favor of the people who are in power. And in a sense, there's a degree of paranoia here. But, we see this explicitly on the woke left. The woke left sees the world in terms of oppressors and oppressed. The oppressed are the ones who lack power. The oppressors are the ones with power. That's really their definition of it. And for them, all of human society is about power relations. Yeah. And having power is automatically puts you in an oppressor status.
Well, it's interesting though, because there is an anxiety built into that I think doesn't often get exploited, if you will, or at least exposed. And it is because they're dealing with constructed identities for which, if they don't have power politically on their side to hold up that construction, they don't have an identity. And this is you think about the frail identities, especially with the left, right? I mean, first and foremost, the identities that are established by the breakdown of the household and normative creation ordered forms of enacting it. They don't have that. So they have a constructed world. You need a safe world to protect certain people, to be able to be protected from natural people who are more powerful from abusing them, for example. Or take a gender, the gender confusion. If you don't have a power in place that allows you to express and affirm all of that, it isn't natural. It's a technologically altered appearance, and it is a political power that has to be in play across the board uniformly in order for you to, quote, feel safe living that, fantasy out, if you will. And so you have to have that. Now, the flip side is a lot with the right is because similarly, the disconnection now of a lot of its identity from traditions that form identities, right? They now become, the Enlightenment did a lot of damage by lifting up all of our senses of identity from their roots in history and culture and place, and thinking you can have be free of its determinations by being an enlightened person. And what do you do once that enlightenment becomes one more form of that? Then you have nothing. So everyone's running to embrace these traditions and identities, but they're buffered against them. They're not really formed and shaped by them. They have to get back to them and get them in place by power. Otherwise, they don't have the natural gifts that hold them in place without needing political power to hold them in place.
Yeah, that's a great insight, Tom. I hadn't thought about it quite that way. I think, when it comes to why are people on the right approaching things the way they are, I think you've got a good point. I think it's because it's no longer kind of a given. no longer kind of, I just grew up this way, these are my people. You're already alienated from that because of things that have come in to separate you from that.
Yeah.
And now you're trying to get back to that, and you need power in the same way the left needs power to pull that off.
Exactly.
That's very good.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the irony on the left is that they talk about oppression, and yet, okay, women are oppressed. Look at the number who are in doctoral programs and who are in elite positions. The LGBT, look at the entire agenda, the progressive agenda. Who controls the media? Who controls big tech? Who controls censorship on the web? Who controls the Democratic Party? And frankly, a lot of the laws in the country. Talk to me about being without power here. By the way, the reason why they're going after X is it is the only place where they don't have power.
Yeah. But you need absolute control to assuage that anxiety.
Right. Yeah. But this notion that they are the oppressed, that they are the weak people in this, is patently absurd on the surface.
Yeah.
But that is crucial to their identity, because if they accept the fact that they have power, then they have to accept the fact that they're the oppressor, because that is what the ideology tells them is the essence of having power.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, Glenn. I also think that there's another feature to this, and that is that they kind of know that if their superstructure or sort of the scaffolding they have set up to make this were to collapse in a heartbeat, everything would sort of go back to form, return to form. It's not as though if for example, the American political arrangements fell apart tomorrow, that suddenly we'd actually be in, looking for a kind of feminist utopia to emerge. It would actually be warlords and a bunch of essentially groups of men who would reestablish order in small pockets, and so there is a kind of war against nature.
Yeah.
So I think that part of the hysteria of the left is due to the fact that they know that they're at war with just kind of the fundamental structures of reality.
Yeah, but this is key, because they're at war with nature, of course, nature in its brokenness, right? Mm-hmm. Red tooth and claw at something, and that is a frightening thing. Christianity is not at war with it because Christ has overcome it. And so the church's life and the church's capacity, when it's allowed to do its thing, is actually relate to that nature the right way, recognizing there is red tooth and claw, but actually that's not the real state of nature. That's a broken state. And that the endowment of Christians enacting their faith in the Spirit allows them to get a hold of something of what it means to live our created natures out the right way, as a father, as a wife, as children, ordered the way God intended, and with life and power to overcome those aspects of red truth and claw that could take it into kind of raw nature versus a healed nature. But you're exactly right. The scaffolding is there in another sense, because there isn't any church influence anywhere to be an alternative as well, because it either is caught up in one or two of those dynamics, contributing to the scaffolding to hold nature at bay, or running into the red tooth or claw world without actually showing us something else.
I'd like to have you, Glenn, share with us a little bit more about your take on Churchill, if you don't mind. I guess my thought is when I think about Churchill, I obviously have a kind of unreconstructed, or I don't have the revisionist view. I've always thought of him as kind of a champion of Western culture, mm-hmm. Kind of a last stand of it in some ways. Where did that go in this revisionism? Is that even addressed? Is he portrayed as sort of like a proto neoliberal or something?
Yeah. Well, My take on Churchill is basically drawn from my understanding of humanity. He is a flawed individual. Having said that, he is, he has his flaws. He's not a white knight. But overall, he is one of the great leaders of the 20th century. And he is very definitely on the side of the angels. Given, as much as any human being is, given the fact that he's human and he's fallen and he's got flaws. I think the description of him as sort of a hero upholding Western civilization, and actually the best parts of Western civilization in many ways, is in fact accurate. And actually, on the left, that's what they hate about him.
Right.
Because you see, again, think about power dynamics. Western civilization was the dominant civilization in the world. It was the one that had the power. That must mean Western civilization is evil and is oppressive. So the fact that he is a champion of Western civilization to the left makes him, well, evil. Okay. Now, when you look at him from the right, the criticism of him from the right is really interesting. And this goes back to Pat Buchanan. Everybody cites Buchanan's book to prove that Cooper is right. Look what Pat Buchanan said, sort of ignoring the fact that real historians of World War II have shredded Buchanan's book. But the fundamental argument here is that Churchill could have avoided the worst of the war. But in order to do that, you have to actually pay attention to chronology. Hitler invades Poland on September 1st. Churchill was not in power then. However, Churchill had been pushing for Britain to arm in the hope that it would discourage Germany from going to war. He'd been pushing that in the 30s. Chamberlain is prime minister. They set up a defense treaty with Poland to try to prevent Hitler from invading Poland. Hitler invades Poland on September 1st, 1939 anyway. In keeping with the defense treaty they set up with Poland, France and England declare war on Germany. Hitler was by all accounts upset by this because he thought they would back down the way they did with Czechoslovakia. There's a period of time known as the Phony War, and then on May 10th, it's 1940, Hitler strikes across Belgium into France. May 10th, 1940 is the day Churchill became prime minister. He cannot be blamed for provoking that attack. Churchill manages, they get defeated handily. They manage to retreat, get a lot of their people across at Dunkirk. Hitler then, and this is what Cooper and the others points out, Hitler then started dropping leaflets over England, basically saying, hey, look, I don't want to fight you guys. You're fellow Aryans, you're Anglo-Saxons, you're fellow Aryans. You're not my enemy. I'm after Russia. Why don't we have just surrender? We'll have a peace treaty. You can keep your empire, all of those kinds of things. This is what he's promising. And what Cooper says is at this point, Churchill should have accepted that. He simply should have accepted that, and that would have avoided the war. Okay, so what he's saying is that Churchill would have been more virtuous by abandoning his allies and abandoning Europe to Nazi domination. That's what he's saying. Yeah. And Churchill is the primary villain of World War II because he wanted to make up for his failures at Gallipoli in World War I by pushing this war against Hitler instead of doing what he should have done and not pushing the war and letting the Nazis dominate France, where, by the way, they deported 500,000 Jews to concentration camps. And leaving the rest of Europe under Nazi control, too. Oh, and then, by the way, let's add the fact that he allied himself with Stalin against Hitler, thereby basically promoting communism, even though anybody who knows anything about Churchill knows that he was a rabid anti-communist. But the immediate danger he was facing was Hitler, so he decided he needed to make a deal with the devil. He hated Stalin. He didn't really trust him, but he knew he needed Stalin if he was going to defeat Hitler, and Hitler was the immediate threat.
So what it sounds to me, though, like is it's not so much a failure of fidelity to the Western tradition so much as it is a failure in judgment in terms of prudential governance. I agree with your take, Glenn, that Churchill needed to honor his promises and so forth. And I'm just trying to understand the nature of this critique that's coming from the right, and it seems kind of odd.
The critique says, number one, he could have saved an awful lot of Allied lives by just simply surrendering to Hitler, by accepting Hitler's offer, as if you could really trust Hitler to carry out his word. Yeah. He should have just accepted that, which would have had the effect of leaving Europe under Nazi domination.
Right.
And the other half of the critique is he cozied up to Stalin and thereby opened the door to communism and the whole problem with the left we're facing today, sort of ignoring the fact that we've got this Cold War in between where we were opposing communism tooth and nail. But that we're not going to talk about that. Churchill is somehow responsible for all of that in the fevered imagination of the people who push these kinds of theories. Right. And I know I just lost us some listeners, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I the whole nature of this particular, outrage du jour with Tucker and everything, I didn't dive into it at all. I just sort of saw the flashes in the distance.
Quick note: the only reason this is important is because, number one, it was Tucker.
Right.
But number two, it's an interesting illustration, I think, of this kind of ideological approach to history that tells you the post-war consensus, that whole thing, which comes from Stephen Wolfe, by the way, that whole way of viewing history, this post-war consensus is fundamentally a lie that was put in place to promote a particular political, ideological vision, myth for America that would get us to back the government in what they're doing and so on. But it's really a lie. It's really just a story we've told ourselves that really isn't true. The real truth is this other thing. That is the thing that I am most interested in. The details, and so on how he forms the argument. That they're a lot of nonsense, but they're sort of interesting, I suppose, on some level. But the thinking that goes behind it, I'm struck by the commonality with the left and by the fact that they end up picking the same people as villains. Because those same people are important people. They're key people in the history, so they have to be taken down, whether by the left or the right. They have to be taken down in order to dismantle the consensus view in order for either the left or the right ideological view to win.
So as you're looking at this, Glenn, you know a whole lot more about what's going on than I do. What is your sense of the program that this fellow at Martyr Made, Cooper, and others who maybe share his outlook? What is the program they're pursuing? What is the ideological vision?
Well, yeah, what Cooper said is that we are living in, he didn't call it the post-war consensus. Like I said, that's Stephen Wolfe's terminology, but it's effectively what it comes down to. We have this myth of America that has been in place since World War II, where we're the bastion of democracy. We're the ones who defend freedom and so on around the world. We're the essential players on the world stage, all of these kinds of things. And he says that, we got this because of this faulty understanding of World War II. And he said, frankly, it's going to take decades before we are in a position to objectively actually reassess our position in World War II. But eventually, we will be able to take an objective look, and then we will find out, he implies, then we will find out that my interpretation is really the correct one.
Well, I get
and
that.
And the reason for that is he's trying to promote this idea that we need to get away from this image of America, because where does this lead? America is not the bastion of democracy. America is not the essential player on the world stage. We shouldn't even have gotten involved in that war in any event. And what we need to do is move away from foreign intervention. We need to move to a more isolationist stance. We need to move to focus more on what we're doing. We shouldn't be supporting, we know from other things he's done, we shouldn't be supporting Israel. We certainly shouldn't be in Ukraine. We shouldn't be having all of these other defense commitments. He's basically pushing, I think where this goes is it leads to this sort of an isolationist America, and in many cases, I don't know about Cooper, but in many cases, viewing America as an ethno-state, which I think is really dangerous. I don't know that Cooper goes there. I have to be clear here. I don't know that Cooper goes there, but other people in this particular way of thinking do. There's some very strong racial components to some people, not all of them, but to some people who make these kinds of arguments. I guess that's where some of the danger comes from that side.
Yeah, I guess the thing
aside from just bad history. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I guess the thing I'm thinking about is there are certain, you don't have to go to, they say, ethno-nationalism or to the revisionist take on World War II to make a case for maybe pulling back American involvement in parts of the world. You can make a case for that based on just, does it work? You can make a case based on, can we afford it? You can make a case.
And sometimes our hands just don't belong in certain places.
Right. And all of that, I think all of that is valid, and those are good discussions to have. Yeah. Right. My point isn't that we should be everywhere and do everything that we're doing. Yeah. But you ask what the end game for these guys is, and I think the end game is to dismantle this vision of what America is and is about and our place in the world, to rebuild it into something else. And I'm not entirely sure what that is, but isolationism, I'm sure, is part of it.
Well, I guess my thought is I'd like to sort of retrieve some of the things that these folks are promoting under this particular vision you just described, and just simply propose that these are prudential actions, not things that require a new kind of sort of interpretation of our involvement in World War II,
right?
That kind of thing,
right? And the other part of this, now I mentioned Israel there in passing. The other thing that's interesting is that left and right are both really down on Israel. Right. There's some rather blatant anti-Semitism on both ends of this. On the right, you see a sort of attempt to at least semi-rehabilitate Hitler.
On
the right, and on the not entirely, but a little bit at least. He wasn't the real enemy. Stalin was. We sided with the wrong people in World War II. I've heard that. These kinds of things. We should have sided with Hitler and gone after Stalin. This kind of thing. Or you get them championing Hamas, and I've seen that from both right and left. So you've got there's that component of this as well. And again, it's both sides, both extremes end up at the same place, maybe for different reasons. But that's the other curious part of this.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, and again, I mean, I understand, as a Christian, having my own senses of, just where does the nation you live in get things right and where does it get off track. And I do read it as a Christian. I'm not reading it as someone else. So I would have a lot of critiques in some areas and a lot of things that say, look, under the conditions of the world we're in, that's probably a better path of representing certain forms of Christian influence than not having it there, right? There is some salt and light happening here in some strong ways, influenced by long histories of Christian influence that have not eroded yet. And those are, again, those are, solid building blocks. But it's interesting here that you have, one, the central issue becomes American identity, which itself, I mean, you're starting to have here now, I mean, again, maybe I'll come at another angle. I have for a long time had my own criticisms of the Enlightenment, not because I'm someone that is in love with postmodernity. These are things I saw back before that range of critiques entered into my own mind through studies, right? And nevertheless, with that said, I never set this kind of myth that was promoted, and you look at some of the old films at the end, fighting justice for everyone in the world. You see how some of the films ended, and I understood that was part of a culture representing its best face, putting its best face, myth forward. So we all have some of that, but on the flip side, when we start to get into these entanglements, that in a world where there are a lot of bonds of imperfection, that the better bonds to have are between two sets of evil, just so happen to be the one after the fact we think we should have aligned with versus not. What is that? Hypothesis contrary to fact? I mean, that's the fallacy being committed there, right? You don't get to pick that. What you get to deal with is the mess you're in now. So yeah, you can sit here and kind of say, okay, now that we have these conditions, we need to go for a complete revision of all these things. But you're gonna have to make a stronger case to deal with the fact that this is where we are now. These are the things that led here, and your solutions are not going to be convincing if you're going to tell me the whole reading of the past and every action that the U.S. or Britain did were wrong or bad.
The curious thing about this is that I think that the far right was created by the far left. In other words, I mean, think about it. I've said this for years. When you start telling kids that masculinity is toxic, that white people are the source of all the problems in the world, things like that. When you start pushing these kinds of ideas in school, and you're a little white kid in school, and you're thinking, this stuff isn't my fault, what's it going to do? Either you're going to internalize this stuff, or it's going to push you far to the right. It's going to push you. It's going to push you to reject this stuff and push you further and further to the right. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the woke right, as I would describe them, is produced as a reaction to the woke left.
And I think this is where I think in Western culture we are beholden to Hegelian dialectic, all of us, because this is what's happened. Rather than the classic way of dealing with these through classic dialectic, right? Argument, reason, the logos, reality. We're dealing with them now as an opposing narrative. And these opposing narratives are spawning the opposite. And now what you're doing is what you're talking about, Glenn, getting a strange synthesis, right? A synthesis between hyper right, hyper left, because they share a lot of the common, cultivated ground. They're starting to see the same figures in a strange new synthesis or unified way, which will begin the process again. So, I think for a long time, we have been indirectly impacted in the West through a lot of Hegel, even if it's come in its Marxist forms but these variety of woke forms. And I think it has affected our psychology so much that that's the way we interpret it. If I'm told all the time, and we've said this a lot, if I'm told all the time, my psychological reaction is going to actually say, okay, well, that's who I am. And that is the kind of the polar reality to what is being affirmed. It's the rebel form, but they share basically the same root. And so they will become part of a new identity of right and left over against something else. In this case, older ways of Enlightenment reading of the past.
I think it would be worth picking up a kind of picking up a theme that Eugippius, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Eugippius on Substack, he posted something today concerning the concern in Germany that so many young people are turned to the right. So you have these middle-aged, leftists who have children who are now voting for, the right candidates, in
Alternative
politics.
for Germany.
Yeah, the alternative for Germany and all that. And in one hand, it's something that you look at and you kind of feel some amusement as you watch it play out. But on the other hand, it kind of ties into what you're getting at, Glenn. I guess the thing I'm thinking about, and I don't have any proposed way to sort of move forward about this, but is it necessary for us to have a kind of coherent and shared understanding of the past in order to take actions in the present that just make sense? In other words, we can have some disagreements about whether or not the War of Northern Aggression or the Civil War. but today, here we are on the ground. We happen to be in the same country. We maybe feel some strong kind of sentiments when that conflict is brought up. But we recognize, okay, Taiwan is over there, and they're an ally of ours, and we've made some promises to them. And then if they're attacked, we ought to have some kind of appropriate response. What I'm getting at is that, to me, that it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with seeing ourselves as like the defenders of freedom and democracy in the world. It may have something to do with just the fact here is a sovereign state whose sovereignty has been challenged by another state, China, the People's Republic. And we have made some promises. Now, you could debate whether or not those promises ought to have been made, but do we really need to kind of go to the question of our self-understanding as defenders of democracy and just forget the fact that, hey, we made a promise? And it seemed like it was a good promise to make at the time because it secured some mutual benefits for each side.
Yeah, the problem is you can use exactly the same line of reasoning for Ukraine because both the U.S. and the USSR or Russia guaranteed mutually the sovereignty of Ukraine. Yeah. So if you're going to make the argument for Taiwan, you got to make it for Ukraine too. Well, and yet people don't want to do that. At least a lot of people on the right don't want to do that. But they might do it for Taiwan. So where do we go from there?
Well, when we think about Ukraine, and again, I'm not saying one way or the other. Just to make sure I understood you correctly, Glenn, you said the U.S. and Ukraine had
U.S. and Russia both. If my memory is correct, and I probably should double check this, but if my memory is correct, both Russia and the United States provided security guarantees for Ukrainian sovereignty. Okay,
so so we've made some promises. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something to consider. Now, maybe going forward, we're just more circumspect about promising people stuff. But if we've made a promise, at least insofar as it's still feasible to keep the promise, we should.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The broader question that you're asking is how much do we need a common understanding of our history for that?
Right.
And is it possible for us to make prudential and pragmatic decisions without a common understanding of history? I think that's probably correct up to a point.
Yeah.
But I think we also need a common understanding of our history. We need to know who we are, what we are, which only comes from understanding our past in order for us to chart a direction forward rather than to be reactive and just deal with situations as they come up.
Yeah, at some point you have to have some way of telling and understanding the story in order to know, what is consistent with your dealing with issues of expediency and being prudent and the like. But I understand the point there is that until we work these things out, we still got to make these decisions, and we have to draw upon a wellspring of things we do share because we share life together. A common good. There are common goods that are ingredient in the fabric of creation itself, much less nations, right? And these things are not all obfuscated and ideologically closed to us, right? Until we've got the right political lens to read them. That's naive too.
Yeah, remember Orwell. I think it was Orwell. Whoever controls the present controls the past, and whoever controls the past controls the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually history, Orwell, I think, was right there. History does matter.
Yeah.
In terms of immediate decisions, we got a situation we got to face right now, and we don't have a consensus about who we are and all of that. Yeah, maybe we can reach a decision about an immediate situation. But charting a path forward is really difficult if you don't know who you are.
Well, related to this, thinking about Churchill and what occurred in World War II, I think that what seems to be absent is a sympathetic reading of the motives and the sort of the thinking that went into making decisions. So if just to use the example that you brought up, Glenn, and again, I've not been part of this debate, but it sounded as though there was a kind of, vendetta that maybe Churchill had for Germany because of some things that occurred in World War I. It wasn't that far back in time. In other words, a lot of the people who were on the ground making decisions were veterans of World War I. And it's easy to understand why you would think the Germans were the big threat, because it's like round two.
Well, it's important to note that was Cooper's argument. Cooper said that Churchill failed signally at Gallipoli, which is in fact accurate, and that he wanted World War II to happen to make up for his failure at Gallipoli. There was a psychological thing going on, he argued, which is probably why he referred to Churchill as a psychopath. Except there's no evidence that that's what Churchill was actually doing. That is him reading this into Churchill. When there's plenty of evidence that there was a lot of other stuff going on in Churchill's head rather than that.
Yeah, I was trying to pan it out and sort of looking a larger, but just thinking specifically about that failure, but just thinking about, okay, who is the threat? Are we afraid of Russia? I think that there was a fear of communism, for sure. But are we really afraid of Russia, or are we afraid of Germany, who's physically closer to us and we know is formidable? Again, I'm just sort of speculating. I'm not proposing anything.
Well, again, remember, Churchill only became prime minister literally the day that Germany invaded Belgium and from there into France. Literally that day. Who is the immediate threat?
Right. Yeah, it's right next door.
Yeah.
So anyway, we got to the end of the time here. We really ought to wrap it up. So, Glenn, it's been your show. Is there anything you want to say to put a kind of a ribbon on it?
Yeah, as I said, the point here isn't to rehabilitate Churchill or anything like that. The guy's flawed, as everybody is. But the revisionist take on him is, frankly, a lot of nonsense. But the key point is the ideological drives to take down the narrative, which the accepted historical view of what happened and why it happened. On both the left and the right, there is a reason for this, and it's ideologically driven, ultimately because they have a competing vision of what they want the world to look like and where they want to drive the world to be. And what they're doing, in order to get there, they have to dismantle how we see ourselves, which means they have to dismantle the history. Whether it's a 1619 project, America is founded on slavery and racism, whether it is attacking the post-war consensus or what have you, it's all about the same thing. It's all about this ideology that wants to replace the vision of the world that we have now with something that, whether on the left or the right, they think is the superior vision. But it's really a blinkered way of looking at the world driven by a few core ideological convictions, and anything that doesn't fit them has to be dismissed or thrown out.
Okay, well, we'll end on that. All right. Well, it's great to have had you listen all the way to the end of this edition of the Theology Pugcast. We really do appreciate the fact that you have made it to this point in the show. And your reward is to hear us talk about Patreon, which is a great place. We believe in Patreon, and Patreon is something that really helps us pay the bills. And if you'd like to be a contributor, if you'd like to be part of the effort here and help us get the show out each week, you can follow the link to the Patreon page and become a regular supporter. We hope you'll do that. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.